I'd like to introduce Stephanie Booth, who's come to speak to us about being multilingual in a world that thinks everyone's monolingual. Stephanie is a social software consultant who's worked in the US, the UK, and Switzerland, and has been bilingual all her life. One thing I should say is that this talk is being recorded for public presentation, so if you're going to ask questions, make sure you don't ask Google secrets in the questions. Thanks very much, Stephanie.
Alors, bonjour tout le monde, je suis vraiment désolée pour le petit incident technique là. Comme c'est une présentation sur le multilinguisme, je pense que je vais vous la faire en français. Okay, who understood all that? A few French speakers in the room. Okay, don't worry, I'll continue in English. I was just apologizing for the technical glitch. I stupidly forgot my VGA adapter at home. So there we go. I assume that most of you are familiar with the works of Douglas Adams, who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And so therefore you know that the BabelFish, depicted up here, is a little fish that you place in your ear, and it allows you to telepathically understand what is said to you in any language. So it's a really, really useful little animal. And it's actually a literary device that Douglas Adams came up with, because he had a character who would be, you know, exploring the universe, and it seemed a bit preposterous to him to imagine that everybody in the universe spoke English. So he invented the BabelFish to get around that problem. Now, okay, how am I supposed to move the next slide? Okay. So, to me, the internet, which I like to imagine as a big space cruncher, puts us in a situation quite similar to Arthur Dent, Douglas Adams' hero, when he suddenly discovers that there's a whole huge universe out there filled with strange beings who have, you know, very different eating habits and speak different languages. So what the internet does for us is that it puts us in touch very easily with people from other cultures. I think that's an important characteristic of the internet if you look at it from a cultural point of view. And if you look at the history of human beings, before the internet and space travel, if you wanted to get in touch with people from other cultures, the first thing you had to do was go there or wait for them to come here. Space was the first obstacle upon your way to meeting other cultures. Now this has changed. We have our form of space travel, and the first obstacle along our way to meeting different people is often language. So the basis of this talk is that I think it's important to be able to get in touch with people from other cultures. I'm not questioning that, okay? So people might disagree, then this will be of no interest for them. But assuming that getting in touch with people from other cultures is something we want to do, then we need to be aware that the borders on the internet are linguistic. I've got one example of this. I come from Switzerland, which is a multilingual country. In Switzerland, we have 4 official languages: German, which is the majority language, French, Italian, and a small language spoken in some valleys called Romansh. Well, one day, somebody decided to organize a Swiss blog contest, or Swiss blog awards, okay, to single out the best Swiss blogs. Well, this initiative broke down because of language questions, because Switzerland on the internet doesn't really exist. I'm from the French-speaking part of Switzerland, and I have much more in common, or I know much more about what's being done in France or in French-speaking Quebec than what's being done in my country, but in German, because my German is really bad. And anyway, Swiss German people don't speak German, they speak Swiss German, which I haven't learned. So countries aren't really relevant. They are in some situations, we'll see why, but very often the most important thing is language. And so there are some multilingual people who act as bridges to help us cross these linguistic borders. And some of what I'm going to tell you today comes from my experience as being a bridge person. I was born in England, Swiss mother, English father, so I learned English and French, happily. And so I've always been, one foot in one culture, one foot in another, one foot in one language, one foot in another. And in my experience as a bridge person, I've noticed that the tools we use on the internet don't help me do my job. Actually, they get in the way. Simple example, I'm a blogger to start with, and blog tools assume, almost all of them, that you're blogging in one language. That doesn't help somebody be a linguistic bridge between two linguistic groups. So I'm going to talk first about localization, and then try to move beyond localization to what really interests me, and which is what I call multilingualism online. So to start with, I'd like to address two common misconceptions about languages on the internet. Can anybody tell me which flag this is? Australian. Okay. So first misconception is, but everybody speaks English. And the people I often hear saying that, and I do hear people saying that, so it's not something I've invented, are English speakers who've traveled the world a bit. They say, but I've been to Europe and Asia, and these people speak English so well. My answer, well, of course, the people you've interacted with speak English. Those you haven't interacted with, many, many times do not speak English. So I think that at Google, people are convinced of this. Google is really rather good on the localization side. So I'm not going to make big speeches about this, but it's important to realize that for a lot of people, this is not an evidence, okay? And the other misconception, which is a bit more tricky, is that country equals language. So I'm going to look at this one a bit more closely. Okay, so this messy slide is about what I call geographical abuse. You have an IP address, somebody connecting to your website, so that tells you which country they're in, and logically, that tells you which language they're speaking, right? Not so right. Actually, this breaks down in multilingual countries to start with. I'll give you a few examples afterwards of what happens when you're a minority speaker in French-speaking Switzerland. Not fun. It doesn't work for people who are traveling. If I am traveling to Denmark, it doesn't mean that I suddenly learned to speak Danish. And it doesn't work for expats. I have a lot of English-speaking friends in Switzerland who do not speak French and who do not speak German. So it's clearly an insufficient way of doing things. And if localization is about creating a version of your website or service in another language and then looking at what country people are in to serve them the right language, that is, in my opinion, bad localization. So, a few examples of the guilty. First guilty company, Amazon. If you live in Switzerland like I do, in French-speaking Switzerland, and you type amazon.ch, you are redirected to amazon.de, where you are served a website made for German-speaking people, all in German. And one of the nice things about ordering from Amazon in your country is that you get free shipping. So to get free shipping, I need to use the German website. I can't use the French website. I don't get free shipping if I use the French website. And of course, if I want to buy French books on the German site, they're going to be a lot harder to find. Second guilty company, eBay. If I type ebay.ch, I am served German. Okay? Although nothing on my computer tells people that I speak German, and I am in the French-speaking part of the country. And well, here it's written, parlez-vous français? Cliquez ici. So if I am one of these few little miserable, unimportant French-speaking people, I can click on the link and get a website in my language. But it really feels like an afterthought. One of the worst offenders is PayPal. If you want to be able to sell things through PayPal in Switzerland, well, first of all, you get a site in German. Then you create an account, and you can change your language to English if you want to. So I had the case of a friend who was selling a book in French for French speakers, and who had the choice between using PayPal in German or PayPal in English. He couldn't use the French PayPal site unless he had a banking address in France. And I can feel a few of you breathing sighs of relief, but don't be relieved too long. Google is guilty too. I haven't dug in detail in Google, but I have at least two stories. The first one is, of course, if you type google.ch, Google assumes that you're speaking German, which is not always the case.
At least we give you the links to other languages.
You can click on the links, but what I'm interested in here is the assumption. The basic assumption is you type google.ch, you want it in German. The fact is, when you type google.ch, you can make an assumption that the person is going to want it either in German or in French or in Italian or maybe in English or maybe even in Danish if it's an expat Dane. But you can't single out one language and say this is the one the person wants. Yes, question?
What are the percentages of the
Yeah.
speakers in Switzerland?
I don't have them off the top of my head, but German is a rather large majority. I think it's 2/3 or something like that. French is a good quarter. Italian is much less. You can find those on Wikipedia if you want the exact numbers, but don't have them in my head. Yes?
You have to put it in some language, right?
Pardon?
You have to put it in some language.
Yes. Good point. You have to put it in some language. We'll get there. Another Google incident happened to a friend of mine who is British. She was in Paris for the weekend. She logged into her Blogger account and was presented with Blogger in French because she was in Paris. And that's even worse because she has an account. She is a logged in person and she's served French. Another example I don't have a slide for is Apple. I've been told that iWeb assumes that you are blogging or publishing in the language for which your keyboard input is set. So if I type things with an English layout, I'm speaking English. Or if I'm using a French keyboard layout, I'm speaking French. No. So enough with the bad examples. Here are some of the things that I tell tool builders, often little startups, not big companies. The first piece of advice is plan for non-English versions from the start. You might not be developing them, but if you code something all in English, and then some months or years later think, oh, we should transform this into localized versions, you're going to have people breaking code by trying to insert localization. So plan it from the start. There are also issues like some languages have very different grammatical constructs. Okay, so localization is not just taking little groups of words or even worse, words and translating them. A word like cut in English, C-U-T, can be a noun, can be a verb, can be a conjugated verb. In French, all these are different words, okay, which are spelled differently. Now, I'm not even speaking about Chinese or Japanese. Second thing, as we've seen, don't assume that the country the person is connecting from is a very good indication of the language the person wants a service in. Allow for regional variations. This is an issue that came up on WordPress.com, which is a blogging platform, which is quite well localized. It's outsourced its localization efforts to the community, so people can log into a site and contribute to the translations. And in French, well, there are people in France speaking French, people in Switzerland speaking French, people in Quebec speaking French, people in Belgium too. And there are differences. For example, in Quebec, French speakers are usually feel quite strongly against the inclusion of English words in the French language. So they will really translate or create French words for blog, for example. Whereas in Switzerland, which is a multilingual country to start with, which doesn't have the history of being a linguistic minority against English like the French in Quebec have, where we use English a lot to communicate with the Swiss German people because we don't understand a word of what they're saying. We include English words in our French quite happily. So when you have people from Quebec and people from Switzerland collaborating to try to reach one translation, one localized version in French, it doesn't work out well. So localization is to go further than just the language, but also assume that there are regional variations. English speakers know that there is UK English and American English, and it's often the same thing in other languages. Crowdsource, yeah, I think that localization, if you want to do it correctly, well, if you're Google, maybe you can hire enough people to do it in all the languages. If you're not Google, you need help from the community. I'll come to your question straight away. Having an in-house linguist is also a good idea. Having somebody in the team who is not a developer or programmer, but understands something about languages and culture, that can help. And smart user language detection, which I'll talk more about just in a moment. Yes?
This is about language detection. Can you check the language using JavaScript and check the browser? The browser is in French, right? It's likely to be
Smart idea. I'm not very good at JavaScript, so technically I'm not even 100% sure it can be done. No, actually I'm sure it can be done because sometimes you visit web pages and they tell you what your OS language is and what your browser language is. So let me get on to the next slide. Just a little, there we are. So how would you detect user language? Because as you said earlier, you need to display the page in one language. I mean, you have to choose. How are you going to decide? So this is what I would recommend as a preferred order for picking language to present to a user. The first would be the user's profile. Or if the person has had to sign up for the service, the person might have said, you know, I want my interface in French, or I want my interface in Hindi. So this is the most important thing. It should override all the rest, what the user has said he wanted. Then there is another source of language preferences, which are the browser preferences. Browsers like Firefox, I've put a screenshot there, allow you to say, what is your preferred order for languages for being served content? So I say, okay, I want UK English first, then I want other English. I put it in because I wasn't sure how exactly it worked. Then I went French, and then, okay, I'll put up with a bit of German if there's nothing else, or even Italian if I have to. But I can tell the browser, this is my preferred order. So when I'm visiting a web page, and it exists in French, English, and German, why the heck am I served German if I have things like browser preferences, which tell who wants to hear that I want English first? Then, if that doesn't exist or is not available, then you could look at the OS language or the browser language. If somebody is connecting to a website from a computer which is all in French, with browser in French, and everything in French, chances are he'll be happier with French than with German, even if he's typing google.ch, and most people in ch are going to want German. And last option, or last thing that comes into line, in my opinion, would be geographical location. So it's not simple. It's a mix. I don't know what the best recipe is. Okay, it still needs to be found, but just looking at where somebody is connecting from is clearly not sufficient. And then there are questions like, do I show my user one language, more than one language? I'm happy with French or English. I don't care. I could have both. So if you've got stuff in French you don't have in English, how am I going to be able to express that with a little list like that? Also, what we're going to have to know is how proficient are people in the languages that we're interested in. Yes?
So when you were talking about having to choose a language at some point, like we have to choose to show this stuff in one language, how do you avoid that same discrimination against minority languages and things like that when you need to give them instructions for how to choose the language they want? Like, that's got to be presented in English, or it's got to be presented in German before we even know anything about the speaker.
Well, for example, if I go and download Firefox, Firefox actually rather smartly recognizes that I'm using a Mac and that my OS language is French. And it tells me, and it presents me directly with Firefox for Mac in French. Without me having to do anything. It just recognizes my OS language. So if you can do that for browser download, why can't you do that for presenting a localized version of a web page? It's not more complicated. So, little detour by geography and spatial localization, because I've been complaining against using IP addresses for imagining what language I want. Actually, if you look at what country the person is in, it's one factor amongst several when it comes to deciding what language or guessing what language this person is speaking. But for laws, it's very important. Okay? Anything that has to do with taxes, censorship, for example, if you're going to be shipping stuff, if you're going to be showing porn, for example, in quite a few countries, you are not allowed to show porn to under 18s. But in Austria, for example, which is just next to Switzerland, the legal age for being able to view porn is 14, and it is even the legal age for being allowed to act in porn movies. So if you're in Austria, you can show porn movies with 15-year-olds in it, and it's legal, and in the US, it's statutory rape and kiddie porn, okay? So you need to know what country people are in. But those are two different issues. The language in which you're going to talk to somebody and the laws that you're going to use to decide what content you're going to serve them or how you're going to ship or what taxes you're going to pay is another problem. And I think that they've often been stuck together because, well, it's more practical. So back to trying to define user languages or user language preferences. I'd like to run a little survey in the room. Who here considers that they are perfectly or near perfectly bilingual or multilingual? Okay. Of course, the survey is skewed because you're here because you're interested in the topic, so you're probably interested in languages. Who knows more than one language? Uh-huh. Who hesitated before raising their hand when I asked that question? Only two, okay. It's intentionally vague, right? Because what does knowing a language mean? Does it mean you can have a conversation in that language? Does it mean that you can read in that language? And even reading in that language. Does it mean you can read a blog post? Does it mean you can read simple instructions? Does it mean you can read a book? Does it mean that you can write a letter or write a book or give a talk in that language you know? I'm perfectly capable of reading a short blog post in German if I have to. with automatic translation to help me with the missing vocabulary, I'll find my way. But there is no way I'm going to be giving a talk in German, ever. But on the other hand, I'm perfectly comfortable, both in French and in English, for giving a talk, writing a book, whatever. So this is much more subtle than the know, don't know, checkbox-like thing you're supposed to fill in when somebody is interested in knowing which languages you want to search in or which languages you want to view content in. We need to move beyond that. And I don't know, maybe someone somewhere will come up with maybe a microformat or something where people can give detailed information on what they can do in which languages, and then we can use that somewhere and have kind of a universal language profile that can be used by various applications or services. I think that the very important distinction, if we don't want to go into that much detail, is passive and active language skills. You know that if you know a foreign language, you're usually much better at understanding it and reading it than you are at speaking it. Okay? Expressing yourself is more difficult than understanding. That's already a starting point. So, yes?
Yeah, and on your previous page, you had those two choices like chinois traditionnel, chinois simplifié. And it's basically, these are not two languages, these are two writing systems.
Yes.
So it's your choice, it's your preference, it's not your knowledge.
And so, okay, it's there for Chinese. Other languages have the same issue. So does English. But everybody speaks English that I hear. Yes, in Switzerland, almost everybody has learned English at school. But it doesn't mean they're comfortable enough in English to learn to use a strange web application or tool in that language. So I think language skills, to know what people's language skills are and be able to cater to them is very important. So this is a quote, which I'll read. I don't know if it's very readable. Being human among humans means living in a state of ever-incomplete multilingualism. Actually, I chose this quote because it seems that more people in the world are multilingual than monolingual. This can come as a surprise because when we think multilingual, we think perfect bilingual or perfect trilingual. But if you think of multilingual as has some skills in more than one language, then almost everybody is to some extent multilingual. So why don't we use that? Okay? Instead, at least on the internet, we keep pushing people back into monolingual silos. If I want my website in French, it's going to be 100% in French. So I often get misunderstood when I say that my interests are multilingualism on the internet, because people say, oh, the internet is multilingual. You know, we've got all these localized versions of everything. But the fact that a community is multilingual does not mean that the individuals inside that community are necessarily multilingual, right? Often in multilingual countries, you have less multilingual speakers than in monolingual countries. So the fact that we have multiple monolingual spaces on the internet does not mean that we are mixing languages, does not mean that we have spaces in which people can be happily multilingual and play their part as bridge people. Where can we fit in as multilingual beings online? That's the important question. So, localization is a translation of the interface into another language. Okay, so it's making your site monolingual in various languages. It's nice, but it's not enough. Multilingualization, if you've got a prettier word, please tell me because it's really ugly, would be having spaces online where people can mix languages, which can manage code switching. If you put me in the room with another perfectly bilingual French-English speaker, we are going to code switch. We are going to jump from one language to another because some things are better said in one language, or we're more comfortable in certain topics in one language than another. The subjects I studied at university in French, I'm not actually that comfortable speaking about them in English. I don't have the skills for that. So we're also going to have to find a way to manage different language combinations. I speak English and French. Somebody else in the same space might speak French and German. How are we going to manage that? How are we going to create a space where everybody can be happily multilingual? That's kind of my hope. So 2 examples to start talking about this. One is WordPress, a blogging tool. The other is Twitter, a presence service. So as I said, I come from the blogging scene. Okay, I started blogging a long time ago. And very quickly, I wanted to be able to blog in French and in English. And translating everything just doesn't work, at least not for a blogger, because it's too much work. And bloggers are lazy people. You know, they start writing, they hit publish, and then it's online, and they don't go back to it. So if you look at the tool WordPress, it's well localized. It exists in many, many languages. Language is a blog level attribute. So your blog is in French, or your blog is in German. It assumes you blog in one language, like many tools. And there aren't any built-in strategies for mixing languages in one installation or blog. So there are solutions. So this is a solution I've come up with. Others will have other solutions. I insert excerpts on the top of my posts in the language I'm not writing in. So for example, if I write a blog post in French, I'm going to write a short blurb on top in English to say what it's about. And I do the opposite when I'm writing in English, because translation is way too hard to do. It keeps my monolingual and multilingual audience happy. It even helps some of them, we've got one sitting right here, improve their linguistic skills in French, because I'm not sure Kevin would have been reading my blog had it been only in French, but as it was, you know, sometimes English, sometimes French, well, he plowed his way through the French every now and again. And it, more importantly, it keeps the blogger very happy. Okay, it's a good solution for the person who is publishing. So this is Twitter. Who knows what Twitter is? Okay. Basically, Twitter is a service where you can send short messages saying what you're doing. Some say it's microblogging. Some say it's IM status messages. It's all sorts of things. But it's become pretty popular in the last months. And it's an interesting case because it is not localized. So one could think that this would hinder its adoption by non-English speaking communities. But actually, if you look, there are lots of people using Twitter in non-English languages. Got one example here. You can see one Twitter here in Italian. I think that's because the tool itself is rather simple, and you don't need the interface that much once you've figured out how it works. You know, it's very basic. Fill in a text area and press submit, and that's it. It's rather self-explanatory. But now, this raises questions about language filtering, because, for example, I actually like seeing languages I don't understand, because with my linguistic background, even if you show me something in Spanish, which I've never studied, I can guess what it's about. But there are other people who really don't like seeing things in languages they don't know. They say, I just want to see English. I don't want to see all the bloody French, or German, or whatever. So maybe a service like this could introduce some kind of language filtering. Detect what language the Twitters are in. Okay, that's not that difficult. We've got language recognition algorithms which work more or less, especially if the tool knows that I, Stephanie, am going to be sending Twitters in either English or French. Not that hard to make out if it's French or English. Okay, so here's one example of something that could become a nice multilingual space if we add a few features to cater to everybody's sensitivities. So going multilingual is quite a challenge. You need to create a space which is good for monolingual people, but also good for multilingual people. Actually, the opposite. You need to create a space which is good for multilingual people, but which is also good for monolingual people or people who don't have the right multilingual skills. How do we keep everybody happy? Monolingual silos, in my opinion, do not keep everybody happy. They are a solution, but I think that it's not very difficult to find a better solution. So if we think about going multilingual, there are really two sets of problems, okay? It's a strategic and a technical issue. And the first bit is really the strategic part. How are we going to allow languages to mix, okay? How are we going to manage that? How are we going to do it, really? Are we going to translate certain bits and not others? How are we going to translate them? How are we going to keep the translations current? What are we going to do when we've got content in one language and not in the others? What are we going to show people? How are we going to know what people want us to show them? How do people define their language skills? Okay? All these questions need to be solved before people start writing code. And then, from a technical point of view, you have design issues. People who do localization know this. Different languages take up different screen real estate. Encoding, and lots of things on the technical side are today, in today's web, way more broken than they should be. I bump into encoding problems all the time because I use tools which are made by English-speaking people for English-speaking people to write French. Well, encoding problems just, woo, show up, you know? In HTML, you can define the language of any element using the language attribute. You can define the language of a destination link using the hreflang attribute. People don't use them. People don't use them because there are no tools which take advantage of them. I have a blog which is marked up correctly, in which there are bits of French, bits of English. I stick that in an automatic translator. The automatic translator tries to translate everything from English to French or everything from French to English. Technologically, we should be smart enough to be able to detect what languages are on the page without me telling the translator and being able to say, oh wait, there's a language attribute here. It says I've got a little island of French in the middle of all this English. Oh, so I'm not going to try to translate that little island of French back into French. And little things like that, which if solved, will already make the web a nicer multilingual space. And then there's all the question of language detection and automatic translation. Automatic translation is fun. It's nice if you know some of the source language. It can actually really help. But, I mean, if I use the Japanese automatic translator, from Japanese to English, I've done it once. It gives me a vague idea what the thing is, the source is about, but not more. So there, I've roughly reached the end of the slide presentation. Some photo credits which are not very visible because of the light, but the presentation will be online, so you can find them there. My cat, who is actually a multilingual cat, as he was born and raised in India and then moved to Switzerland, so he had to learn to speak with the French cats. He managed. And I'd be very interested to know if you've got questions or ideas or issues you want to raise, or things you want me to talk about again because I went too fast and it wasn't clear. Julien?
Do you have any experience with tools or plugins from WordPress or other platforms to have translation on multilingual blogs.
So if with translation,
Yeah, so automatic translation or tools to have a multilingual blogs. Because I like the idea of having just a blur in one language and the main article in the other.
well, the thing is, if you really, if I understood you correctly, you're talking about using automatic translation to provide a translated version of the blog.
It doesn't have to be automatic, but it needs to. I don't want two articles. One article on the site in both languages, so that the user can choose if he wants the French or the English version.
Yes, yeah. I did that at some point, quite a few years ago. There was a little toggle thing on my blog. You could say, I want only English or only French. And that is actually really important. I haven't done it because I'm lazy. But as I said, some people really resent being shown languages they don't understand. So I think it's important, if you're creating a multilingual or bilingual space, to allow people to make it monolingual. Okay? Is that what you were asking? Yeah.
I was just wondering if you have experience with some of those.
Yeah, I did it with a bit of JavaScript, and it's not very difficult. The code is out there. It's been done. It just needs to be implemented. Yes?
I work on automatic machine translation here.
Yeah.
And besides the lang attribute, which I think would be a great thing for us to
Yeah.
get better, are there other things that you see automatic translation could do much better as it's providing tools to help you?
Well, if the lang attribute is not present, at least trying to recognize the language, so that when I want to translate a page, the default language is source language is not always English, always English to Spanish. It's really annoying. And the other thing would be presenting source and translation side by side in two columns, because as I said, I think automatic translation is most useful when you already know the source language. So typically, for me in German, I did 9 years of German at school, so theoretically I'm supposed to know it, but I never used it. I was bad at it at school. I don't know the vocabulary anymore. So if I could display German on the left, English or French automatic translation on the right, I would be able to read through the German, which I more or less understand, and use the automatic translation to help. Okay, so that would be kind of layout which would be really useful.
Another comment is that don't assume you're doing language detection of the pages in one language. Right?
Yeah,
Which is
yeah,
definitely.
yeah. There is this basic assumption on the internet that one page equals one language, just like the other basic assumption that one country equals one language. It's just not correct. Yes?
Clearly, there's a lot of things you have to do to improve the technology and how the website is designed, but in the meantime, I feel like there's a big factor of frustration and insult with presenting the wrong language options.
Yes. Especially when they're a linguistic minority.
But like, what would you suggest in trying to avoid some of that while we're still waiting for the technology?
I would just start by, instead of using geographical location, I would use the OS language. I think it's a much better bet. Because if people are using English as their OS language, they understand enough English to use the website in English too. And then at least Google already has the option for the user to change the language. And of course, if the user changes the language, set a cookie or whatever to remember it, which is also something which is not technologically new. But I'd say that OS language or browser language is a much safer bet than location. Yes?
You were mentioning the multilingualism on some of the websites, and I was wondering how, the example you were giving is how you would know some technical material in a certain language, but if you speak to somebody who speaks two languages, you may speak about different topics in different languages, right? But how would you imagine this being presented sort of on a website where we do not know perhaps as much personal information about the people in terms of how do we decide what language they'd be more comfortable talking about certain subjects?
Well, I think that one thing that could help there is having a kind of universal language profile for people, so that I could define somewhere, these are my language preferences, and then any any tool or website could go and pick them out. The thing about being more comfortable in certain languages with certain topics, I think, is, well, really ahead of where we are. I haven't actually thought about that.
It would be interesting even sort of in the interface, how would we, maybe certain things in the interface, if we don't have a language,
Yeah.
would be more useful.
You could have multilingual interfaces. For example, I was talking with a friend of mine who has learned Welsh. And she said, well, you know, Microsoft has made a Welsh version of Windows. But even the Welsh people don't use it because Microsoft have gone so far as they've translated all the error messages, and the Welsh people don't understand the error messages because they've had to kind of invent technical words in Welsh. Okay? Well, she was saying that if there was Gmail in Welsh, if it was 100% in Welsh, she wouldn't be able to use it because it would be too confusing. But you could imagine graded mixes of languages. For example, Welsh with English tooltips. Or you could have, you know, a bit of Japanese. And, I mean, then you can start dreaming about, you know, using interfaces as learning tools for learning foreign languages. If you're going to be going in Japan in a year, you could slowly move your OS over to Japanese every month, adding a bit more, you know, things like that. But, well, be creative. Yes?
You talked about the assumption that you're seeing on a lot of sites that country equals language.
Yes.
How much evidence do you see of the opposite? That they're doing language detection and deciding your country based on that? You talked about the censorship issue. Like, I know specifically of one case, which is eBay's restrictions on viewing items like Nazi memorabilia is illegal in certain European countries, and they do that based on your language as opposed to.
That's a really bad idea too.
So I was wondering how much if you've looked at that or how much you've seen.
I didn't know about that, so you're telling me about it. I don't think. I think that in general, the bond between language and country is overrated. Okay, so it goes both ways. Assuming that I speak this language because I'm in this country, or assuming that I'm in this country because I speak this language, is not the smartest move. Sometimes you can't do otherwise. Sometimes you're left with it's the only thing you've got. But you should try the other solutions first. Yes?
So all your solutions on the various ways to detect languages, none of those work for the person who's traveling and going to an internet kiosk. Do you see any solution to that? I mean, I don't, but if you have any suggestion.
I didn't understand your question. None of the examples I gave were...
So if you're traveling,
yes.
Now you're going to Japan and you sit on an internet kiosk,
yes.
Right?
Okay, if I'm not traveling with my computer. Yeah.
It says there's nothing to do, but maybe you can have a better insight than me.
Travel with your laptop first, if you can. That would be my best solution, especially if you're going to Japan. I'd say that if you're traveling to Japan, have to work on a Japanese computer, and you don't know enough Japanese to find your way in the computer, you're in a mess anyway. So I don't know if it really happens a lot. I guess it will, but no.
Yeah, there is a similar issue. You're a tourist anywhere, like a Russian in France and French in Russian, and you go to an internet cafe, and all you see is Russian or French interface, the language you don't understand. So that's an issue. You have to switch to your language.
Yeah. Well, that's a problem which is on the OS level. Okay. Because the problem is a computer to start with. So you know, the OS would need a nice little switch to allow you to say, oh, change this to English, please. But it's not, for me, it's less of a web issue than an OS issue. Yes?
It just seems, you had the blogger example where when your friend was in
Yes.
Paris, they got the French version of the blogger, but we had their account information, right?
Yes.
Like, I feel like if I was on a Japanese computer, I could find the browser and I could type blogger.com into my browser, right? And if once I logged in, I could probably figure that out even if none of my interface was correct. But once I did that, it would show my language.
Well, Yeah, well, the present situation now is that you're in Japan, so anyway, you're going to see Japanese, whatever you log on. So there are, I know that WordPress.com does this. The localized versions are available on, you do fr.wordpress.com and you have the French version. So you can ask for the language version of a site directly by just adding the language code in the URL, which is really rather simple. So when I give talks in Switzerland and I tell people go and look at WordPress.com, I tell them go to fr.wordpress.com because I know they're French speakers and they won't be put off by landing on an English page to start with. Yeah. Other questions? I don't know what time it is, actually.
It's 3:05.
Ah, that's why the computer disappeared. Okay, right. Well, if you've got more questions or ideas I want to talk about this more, my details were on the screen. They're not anymore, but I've got little cards with my email address on them if you want them. And thank you for your attention. It's nice to have you all here.